Welcome to the webinar here, the Global Exchange sponsored webinar, Connecting the Dots, Drug War, Mass Incarceration, and the Movement for Black Lives. The United States is in the midst of a public health nightmare that has hit vulnerable workers with a special vengeance. The pandemic has hit those in prison or held in immigrant detention facilities the hardest. At the same moment, our George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Sean Monterosso moment, we're living a transformative mass revolt against racism and police violence that has deep community roots and majority support across the country, even as it faces a virulent opposition and election year crackdown by President Trump and his followers. Today, we take a look at the drug war, a feature of our national life that has for decades been a core pretext for racist policies. Over the last half century has been the principal driver of racist mass incarceration and the hyper-militarization of police and public security. To connect the dots between the drug war, mass incarceration, and the movement for Black and Brown lives, we have three leaders and three movements who work around the issues of the drug war, mass incarceration. They're going to tell us where we are, they're going to tell us where we need to be, and we're going to talk about how we get there. I'm Walter Turner. I'm the Global Exchange President of the Board of Directors. I'm the moderator of today's discussion. I'm very, very pleased to have three powerful voices in these struggles. Kassandra Frederique of the Drug Policy Alliance, Juan Cartagena of Latino Justice, and Tony Papa of 15yearstolife.com. Hello to our viewers on Zoom, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. Please feel free to share this with your friends. We're about to get into it. Don't go anywhere. For those of you who want to go on the Global Exchange website, www.globalexchange, and support this work, there's a way to donate and so that we can continue this series we've been doing over the last couple of years. Kassandra Frederique is the incoming executive director, congratulations, of the Drug Policy Alliance, a lead organization in the fight to end the war on drugs and put a stop to the excessive damage it has inflicted on Black, Latinx, Indigenous, immigrant, and LGBTQ communities, and build alternatives grounded in science, compassion, health, and human rights. Juan Cartagena is the president and general counsel of Latino Justice. He is a constitutional and civil rights attorney and one of the nation's leading voices on equality and non-discrimination. As a lecturer, as a columnist, as a Rutgers University lecturer, he focuses extensively on Puerto Rican and Latino rights issues, including the community impact of mass incarceration. He works to inspire change to systems that marginalize communities of color. Anthony Papa of 15yearstolife.com is a longtime advocate of drug policy and prison reform. He brings a special vision to this particular panel. His passion is rooted in his own life experiences of a drug bust in his youth that led to a 15-year-to-life sentence under New York's draconian Rockefeller drug laws. Now, after receiving clemency from Governor George Pataki in 1997 and later a pardon from Andrew Cuomo in 2016, he is a frequent public speaker and a college lecturer on art and criminal justice. And we'll hopefully have a chance to talk with Anthony Papa about some of the beautiful artwork that he does and how he uses it in educating communities. We have so much to cover in this hour, so we're going to get started. And basically what we're trying to do, we're trying to connect the dots for you. And then when you leave here, you have more information to go back to your communities, go back to your organization, and continue the work of the three organizations and their communities. First of all, welcome, Kassandra, welcome, Juan, welcome, Tony. Thanks for being here with Global Exchange. Total pleasure. I'm totally honored to be with you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Why don't we start with this? Why don't we start with what is this moment in your work? I'm going to call it this confluence of the pandemic, what we might call the George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Sean Monterosso moment. What is this moment for your work that you're doing, all of you? Share that with us, and then we'll keep bouncing forward. Kassandra?
Okay, well, so thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you to my co-panelists, two men that I love very dearly, and our friends out there. I honestly think this moment is a mirror for our movement and for our community. So many things that so many people have been fighting for a very long time. It's, you know, a lot of people like to say it's at the surface, and I don't think that's true. I think these issues have been at the surface for a very long time. This particular moment, I think part of the reason why we have so many people engaged and paying attention is because people are stuck at home. The world has stopped because we are in the middle of a global health pandemic, and there are no distractions. People can't fill their time with other things, and so there is the truth that is just very bare, and it's hard for us to escape. We are watching the news all at the same time. We are in our homes. We're not flying all over the world. We are in the same space. And so this moment is about incredible political education, and it's an incredible transformative moment, because the questions that people could ignore, or the things that people made up excuses as to why things were the same, it is very clear that this moment that we're in is made up of choices that people are making, from why we don't have adequate healthcare to why we have so many people in congregate housing, either in detention centers or homeless shelters or in jails and prisons. And the fact that it was never about their safety, that it was never about community safety, that these choices are clear, and there are decisions that are being made every single day, and that the killings of people are not coincident. It's not people being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's that they just exist, and their existence is offensive to the state. And I think this is creating that moment where people are realizing that the state is not looking out for the best interests of its people.
Okay. Tony.
If I can,
go
ahead, Walter. No, if I can, this is appropriate time to talk about these things, because thank you for the question and thank you for the invitation. The pandemic is obviously going to have a serious economic impact on our gente, all of our peoples, and especially people of color. The pandemic is elevating the fact that our workers are not considered, quote unquote, essential workers, even though they get paid bullshit wages, even though they don't have any opportunity to accumulate wealth. So the pandemic is actually highlighting the fact that in this exploitative economy that we live in the United States, that the rich continue to get richer even during the pandemic, and the working class continues to be left behind. So as a result of that, the economic fallout of the pandemic is going to be with us for some time. But the moment that you just mentioned, Walter, of this time in our history, of the names of Brianna and the names of Sean and the names of George and the names of Andres Gualdano and many others, many others, is giving us an opportunity. So we need to capitalize on this opportunity that we're finally talking about and questioning presumptions about safety and police, questioning presumptions about cages and our people, and questioning all the presumptions about what led to this ridiculousness that we have today. So this is a very important time for our people collectively, and a very exciting time for me to be in.
Tony.
Yeah, hi. For me, it's a moment of hopefulness where people stay together in community. As an activist, my job is to try to help people who are in prison. I'm in contact with many prisoners, and this is because of my background as a former prisoner. I was a first-time nonviolent drug offender who was sentenced to two 15-to-life sentences for first-time nonviolent drug crime. And I went to Sing Sing prison, where I was lost, didn't know how to survive. And I survived actually from my discovery of my art, became an artist and used it to transcend the negativity of imprisonment. So for this same comparison, I was in prison as I'm out here now. I had moments where I lost hope. But I want to tell people not to give up, especially people in prison who are trapped where there's nowhere to go, and to keep the faith that people are out here, together trying to help them. And my thing is community. We should all be together as in community, helping each other to survive or the pandemic and the other issues that affect our lives.
Let's talk a bit. We talked there in the beginning about the connecting the dots between criminal justice, between the drug wars, and between incarceration, and pushing that first question a bit further. These are just moments of righteous rage about racism, about not only about police brutality, but about systemic racism. I think, as Kassandra has said, these aren't movements that just popped up, but they've been there for a while. Are there some different ways that we look at addressing this racism, some advantages that come to, and some challenges that come from what the Drug Policy Alliance does or what Latino Justice does? I know you're all talkers, so let's go.
Let me take the first crack. I'm sure Kassandra can fill this in. And by the way, I forgot to mention that it is a joy for me to be on the same panel with Kassandra and Anthony, and with yourself, Walter. The fact of the matter is we met many years ago, Walter, at the Global Exchange, support for a caravan to stop the drug war, a caravan that came from Central America.
Right.
And at the end of the day, we have to center our discussions about the drug war in a hemispheric way.
Exactly.
Indeed, in an international way. But your questions go to the core of a lot of issues that are happening right now for all of us in this country. And it goes to the core of the fact that we're prepared to actually take a moment and take advantage of this moment, like I said before, and to try to make sure that we push this as far as possible at this particular moment. To actually think that there's so many people talking about going to the streets and protesting of all races to talk about the defense of Black lives is a very, very special moment in our history. What we have to do now is capitalize on that and make sure it's not just a moment, but actually a movement, and it continues the movement into actual reform. Of course, there will be the pushback. There's things that happen in New York, Walter, that are outrageous. The police union is now suing the state of New York because the state of New York finally is forcing police disciplinary records to be available to the public. And the unions are now in court trying to fight this, even though it was passed by a legislature that's finally reflective, or I should say more reflective, of the people of color who live in New York State. There's always going to be a pushback. There will always be the police unions and the police officers and district attorneys that will find ways to try to slow this train down. We have to make sure the train keeps going. And as a result of that, the efforts that are happening now in this moment in history is just super important for us across the board. For Latino justice, it means very obvious things. One is, no question about it, that we are in defense of and supportive of defending Black lives. We've been saying that for many, many years. It's not a new thing for us to say that for Latino justice. But equally important is to recognize that these efforts to try to compartmentalize ours, to try to talk about that immigration abuse is only a Latino issue, and that criminal justice abuse and policing abuse is only an African-American issue, is a way to compartmentalize and divide us. And the fact of the matter is that in New York City alone, where myself, Kassandra, and Tony happen to be and happen to work, the efforts to try to make sure that stop and frisk, outrageous, excessive policing activities in New York State, in New York City, especially in New York City, were done because of the efforts of community organizations that saw the intersectionality of our struggles. And that's what makes New York City unique. Not only, we've seen it across the board, we've seen this in Los Angeles, where those efforts are doing amazing work to shut down prisons, create more opportunities for mental health facilities, create opportunities to shut down the expenditure of dollars. So this is the moment we have to take advantage of. From our perspective of Latino justice, we are definitely in lockstep of all these efforts on both coasts and throughout the Deep South as well, and in many other places in the country.
Kassandra, I see you bobbing your head. Tell us what's on your mind. What do you want to say?
Well, I think one of the things that is like so amazing to me, and this is actually one of the, it's part of the reason why my work with Latino justice is so important, is because when we think about the drug war, oftentimes people think about it through the lens of criminal justice, but the drug war in its design was a xenophobic policy around immigration, right? So the first drug laws were against Chinese migrants. Marijuana laws were against Mexican folks in the Southwest. And these were about the propaganda around it was creating this idea that foreigners were hurting Americans being white. And they used drugs as a way to ostracize this group of non-white populations as a reason why we should be scared that they are in our lands, right? And then they contextualize that immigration and xenophobic fear with the praxis of criminalization, right? So in order to make people hate people that are not white, they big up their differences. They make it seem as if these people that are non-white, non-English speaking are the worst thing that can ever happen to the white infrastructure of the US. And then they use criminalization as the tool to really reinforce xenophobic fears and propaganda, and use it as a way. The drug laws are one of the first ways of this Make America Great Again, Make America White Again. Like, these are the first ways. Like, the drug war is an immigration policy, right? It is draconian immigration policy, and it is draconian criminal justice work. And so this idea that immigration and criminal justice are separate, are different. It's not real, right? It is different strategies from the same root. They use different excuses to criminalize people in the same ways. And I think one of the things that's so interesting and is so helpful for Juan to be in the work and important is because in New York, the conversation about compartmentalizing communities is very different, because so much of the Latino community is Caribbean, right? And so much of that is Black. So it's like, I've only known Latinos that are both, right? That there's no separation. And so when we are talking about in defense of Black lives, that inherently takes in the Latinx people that are Black, the Black Latinx people. And so it's like this moment that Juan is talking about is inherent in the design. The design is to compartmentalize and to make different people think that these things, some things don't apply to them, that they only apply to other people, or that might not be their fight. And this is inherent in the way that we build the drug war, right? Because the drug war is about creating arbitrary lines between communities that are impacted by the drug war. So you may have people that are incarcerated by the drug war who think, I may be incarcerated for selling drugs, but it's not like I had kids and using drugs, because those people are worse. Or, I wasn't high on the job, because those people are irresponsible. So even within the community of people harmed by the drug war, the apparatus creates a hierarchy of who is most evil, who is more deserving. And we see that in the way that people even think about which drugs are acceptable. The conversation about cannabis and the conversation about heroin right now are very different. But at one point they were equalized, right? And that it was by design and structure and in the way that we've created campaigns that we've also reinforced these different lines. And so when we have the conversation about criminalization, criminal justice, the drug war, and incarceration, they're not three different conversations. They're the same conversation using different language to move the boards around, move the pieces around the board. And the other thing that's super important and why it's so exciting to be here with the Global Exchange is that in the US, we have a super myopic way about talking about the drug war. And it is divorced from the way that the drug war and the criminalization and the xenophobia persists throughout the world. We are responsible for the harms around drugs around the world based on our demand. We want the drugs and we don't care what it takes to get them. And so not only do we have a failed drug war here, we have exported that failed drug war across the world, and we fund it every day, and then we never speak about it. Because, like Juan says, we've compartmentalized where the harm is happening. So people here in the US who are harmed by the drug war are not thinking about the people in South and Central America who are being harmed by the drug war in a different way, because they think those fights are separate. And I think it's about how do we start having conversations together about all these issues, and recognizing that it's one puzzle. It's different pieces, but it's the same puzzle, and that our strategies have to be moving forward together. Because if we continue to compartmentalize, we're going to miss people at the intersection.
You raised some great questions there, and that's part of your task, you three today, is by the time we end this, to know, for our listeners, to know where those conversations can go and are going to go. Tony, we were talking before we came online, and you were talking about using your art as a way of conversation. I know much of your work has been around media, and you come from doing 12 years, as you mentioned, 12 years in Sing Sing. How do you have these conversations that both Juan and Kassandra have talked about in terms of informing people and moving away from the compartmentalization and realizing the dynamics of this?
Well, I think what we need to do is expose the system, expose what is happening, because many people are ignorant to the fact of what leads to mass incarceration. So we must educate them. And what I do with my art is I do educate people through my art. I just did an exhibit. I was at the Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston, an exhibit called Walls Turn Sideways, Artists Confront the Justice System. And 40 artists, and the theme of the show was to show how mass incarceration, the history of it, and how it developed. And my background as an activist, combined with being an artist, I'm using my work, my art, as a vehicle to show people. And I think the best way to do this is with individual cases, to highlight them. There's a case I would like to bring attention to, Sean Worsley, an ex military man who won a Purple Heart, that actually was driving through Alabama and got stopped. And he had medical marijuana in the backseat of the car. Make a long story short, he got arrested and he got 5 years. Here's a disabled veteran who won a Purple Heart that got convicted when he shouldn't have got convicted. There's another case I'm working on, Lou Scamazzo, 21 years for marijuana. He just wrote me and told me about how the virus is ripping through the federal prison system, and people are dying and there's no escape. So people need to be aware of what's happening behind bars. And through my work as an artist, as an activist, as a social commentator, I try to educate people and get people to know what's going on. People want to be interested in seeing the art. You can go to my website, 15thlife.com, and take a tour through the art and the stories that I try to highlight.
Okay. I had the pleasure last night, us journalists, which is what I do, we search through and we look for information. So we try to come up with some things that maybe you didn't even know that you had done that are hidden somewhere, and we search for them. And last night I had the honor of watching Decolonize Justice, which is on your website, Juan.
Good. I'm glad, Walter, you found that and said something else about me. Thank you.
It was so, yeah, I said, well, we'll leave that there. But it was so powerful. I said, well, I'm looking for something that's 5 or 6 minutes. But then I started watching through all the episodes, and I watched a story about the gentleman in Bakersfield, 73 years old, who winds up who ends up getting killed, or the gentleman who stopped in his car. And I just want to recommend that people take a look at that segment. Beautifully done, just wonderfully done. The question here, this growth of militarization in our communities at all different levels, you've highlighted some, but I want to make that connection between what we're talking about with the drug war and this increasing levels of militarization. Because at the same time that George Floyd was being lynched publicly, I was looking on your site again, we didn't hear those names as much, but there were Latino populations who are facing the same situation. So let's talk about this issue of militarization in our communities and how we address that.
It is a feature of the fact that, just like Kassandra said at the beginning, the top of the hour, that most of us who are still at home trying to work from home are, consuming all this news and all these images. At the top, at the conversation that we lead to, Walter, is that we're finally seeing so much footage of the use of militarization in our own streets, as if the lines between local police forces and military U.S. forces have been completely blurred. Is what we saw in Washington, D.C. when they cleared out the park so that the president can hold a Bible in a way that I've never seen anybody else hold a Bible and talk to the press. It's the same way in which people in Portland and other parts of Oregon and other places in the country have been subjected to abuse by officers from the U.S. military who were not even identified on their outfits. It is the same way that we're dealing with the militarization of our police forces. So it goes back many years. Truth be told, the Obama administration, in the second term of the Obama administration, was trying to curtail that, trying to roll it back somewhat. The current administration, of course, just went back to the original formulation. But we saw this, Walter, back in the days of Ferguson, right? We saw this militarization before. We saw the outrageous use of force against protests and First Amendment activity. Within days of Ferguson, Walter, in Rochester, New York, the local police pulled out a tank which was immune to any kind of mines or any kind of bombs. And the only reason they rolled out the tank in Rochester, New York, was to stop Puerto Ricans who were celebrating Puerto Rican Parade Day in Rochester from partying too hard. Now, let that sit for a second. Our police forces have been super militarized on the notion that they need additional manpower and equipment, allegedly to stop, quote unquote, terror attacks from the outside of the United States. And what they have done and what we have seen after day after day after day of coverage in the United States since the protests after the George Floyd killing has been quite the opposite. And that's where we got to start having this conversation to make sure we can roll that back and make sure that our police no longer have the military presence and equipment to actually deal with a domestic issue that should be dealt with in a different way.
Kassandra.
Yeah, and I think oftentimes what people also is that the drug war funds a lot of the militarization, that the drug war is used as an excuse for these police forces to have access to tanks and SWAT teams. Most of the SWAT raids are happening in conjunction of a drug warrant. And so it really begs the question, if we think drugs are a health issue, why are people in tanks and battery armor showing up to your door, right? And when we think about this, an example of this is the tragedy that happened to Breonna Taylor, where she's sleeping in her bed and we have a no-knock warrant with SWAT teams who roll up in there and kill her while she sleeps, right? Like, to me, so often people are talking about, arrest the officers that killed Breonna Taylor. And I'm like, it's not just the officers. Why did the officers have so much equipment? Why are we using no-knock raids? Who was the judge that signed that petition? Why is the city working with a development company a development agency to redevelop the neighborhood, to lead to gentrification, and using police operations as a way to do that, right? Like the militarization serves multiple desires. It's, you know, they want us to believe that we need these tanks to deal with terrorists. And as three New Yorkers on the in conversation together, we were here during 9/11. My mom worked in the World Trade Center. She walked from the World Trade Center to come pick me up from high school. Like, I am very much impacted by that. That does not mean that NYPD should have access to be able to shoot a plane down from the sky, because that is what Raymond Kelly said on 60 Minutes. He said NYPD has the capability to shoot a small plane out from the sky. That is scary. And it's scary because if they have that for a plane, that means they have it for the people in our neighborhoods. And they use it for the people in our neighborhoods. It's this idea that we believe that our law enforcement has the ability to have the responsibility to have access to these materials, and think that they will be able to use their discretion on when to use it. But Juan just told you they used a tank for a Puerto Rican Day parade. We don't see those tanks when these white boys are having a party when their basketball team wins, and they're doing bonfires and they're burning jerseys and they're running up and down and they're looting in the streets because they're so happy that their football team won. The tanks never come out. We cannot give, you know, my mom always says, don't give money away that you can't afford to give. Okay. We cannot give law enforcement materials believing they have the discretion on when to use it, because they don't have the discretion to not kill people where they sleep. They don't have the discretion to not harass people. They don't even have the discretion to not sexually violate women in their custody, because when people talk about the complaints against police, what they often miss is that the number 2 complaint of police violence is sexual violence. And so why are we giving people so much responsibility with little weapons of mass destruction? It doesn't make sense. For drugs? No, that's not what it's for. It's for fear, it's for intimidation, it's for dehumanization, it's for the subjugation of people of color, people that are not white. And we have to be honest about that.
Okay. You all of you three panelists don't have to be bound by Walter Turner trying to be a moderator. You can jump in and out when you want to. You're just hearing the voice there of Kassandra Frederique, the incoming Executive Director of Drug Policy Alliance. Before that, you heard Juan Cartagena, the President and General Counsel of Latino Justice. And I do want to encourage you to go to their site and look at Decolonize Justice. Anthony Papa of 15 Years to Life.com. Walter Turner, President of the Board of Directors of Global Exchange. You can always go to our website. We stream these webinars free to our allies on Zoom, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. This is in part our lifeblood, so you can go on our channel there, Global Exchange. You'll be able to hear some of this after this and make a donation, support our work, write us, tell us things we're doing well, things maybe we're not doing well. We'd love to listen. Let's go straight at something. Let's go at this word defunding. And because I know none of you are confused, but you know how media is, it rips it someplace else. And I think I was reading on Tony's site where he said, what percentage of money goes to schools and education versus goes to police and law enforcement? I've heard you talk about restorative justice. I've heard Juan on his site talking about those populations which are invisible need to be made visible. So when we're talking about reallocation, quote unquote, defunding, why does that need to be a central part of the work that you're doing and that the rest of us like Global Exchange stand for? Jump in, go ahead.
I think that the funding is an important point. I mean, recent protests, I've attended many, and I think the way we bring this to attention is through the media of people getting together and putting the masses in the street. I remember something Al Grandpa Lewis taught me many years ago when I started being an activist. He says, you got to get the the masses and the asses out in the street to get people to get together, and so people take notice of what you're doing. And what just happened recently, where $1 billion in New York City was taken away from the police funds, is an example. And this is done because of people getting together, uniting with the communities, grassroots organizing, and going into the streets and protesting to have a better system, a better way of justice.
Okay. One,
Walter,
where we put our resources. How do we make that fight
Sure,
going
of
forward?
course. Well, first of all, there's the age-old axiom, right, that says, doing the same thing repetitively all the time and expecting for results is basically a sign of insanity, right? So why do we accept the premise that the police are the default response by government when someone is suicidal? Why do we accept the premise that the police are the default response by government when someone is having a nervous breakdown? And why do we accept the premise that you can cage somebody for 20, 30, 40, 50 years on the assumption that that's supposed to help them? So what is incredibly important about this moment in American history is the fact that we are questioning all the premises that lead to the way we do things over and over again. So when people ask me, why would I ever talk about defunding police? My first reaction is, A, the police have excessive amounts of money. Police activity is not very effective. Police activity obviously runs in a way to oppress, cage, and otherwise marginalize and eliminate people of color. But the next thing is, like, what exactly are we thinking is happening in our streets if it's not a questioning of all the basic tenets that we accept every day? So defunding the police, for me, is a very clear indication that we're about to engage in conversations and debates and pushing for policy analyses, first of all, that is led by people of color, that is anchored and centered in our leadership, that addresses the fact that our pocketbooks, our wallets have supported this system, fines, fees, asset forfeitures, et cetera, that we are the brunt of the focus of these systems, and we are the ones that are paying the biggest price. So as a result of this question about defunding police, is like, why continue to fund a system that kills us and continue to fund a system that we cannot otherwise think we can change? And at the end of the day, Walter, why can't we think completely in a different way about, in a transformative way, about what it means to have public safety in our communities? What does it mean to address violence in our own communities and our own definitions? What does it mean to have restorative justice principles be front and center? What does it mean when we say someone has an addiction? And why is it that police and a prosecutor and a criminal judge are the default response? Why aren't we should have had these conversations, and we have been amongst ourselves for a long time having these conversations. But at the end of the day, this is a moment in which the country is starting to recognize perhaps that defunding police is not as scary of a proposition as it might be in their heads, because we need to stop doing the same things over and over again and expect a different result.
Kassandra, talk about the group, the people, the focus, the communities of the Drug Policy Alliance, because you find many people who find themselves like Tony, who pick up a case, they're somewhere, they've got parole, they've got probation forever. Talk about what should be happening in our communities, how we should be thinking about people who find themselves with issues of drugs or abuses, and how it seeps into their families. Where should our monies be going, and what's our plan for getting it there?
You know, one of the things that I've been thinking about as I'm coming into this leadership role at DPA is people need, you know, and this is not rocket science. People need jobs. People are part of informal economies because they are not allowed to be in the formalized economy. And some of our informal economies are criminalized, and we should stop criminalizing them because they are, if you can build an economy, that means there is a need there. You know, to me, sometimes if it's so interesting, as someone who is an anti-capitalist, it's so interesting to me when people don't think that capitalism is appropriate. I think that about people that trade sex, people that trade drugs, like everyone is fine with creating economies. They think it's entrepreneurial. But when it is outside of what people are comfortable with, that is when we criminalize it.
Yep.
Despite the fact that if we're looking at the health outcomes based on sugar, based on salt, based on fast food, none of those things are regulated, and they are being marketed and predatory in the same communities that are being criminalized by informal economies, right? It's, you know, McDonald's is killing us as fast as other things are killing us, right? And there's no conversation about that. And they don't care how predatory their ads are. They don't, like, it's as if capitalism only works for certain people on purpose by design. The fact that people are having to deal in informal economies goes to show that our current economy right now does not work and is too exploitative and cuts people out. And so let's have a larger conversation about what a just economy looks like, right? The other thing is, when we're thinking about access to healthcare, that is inherently a drug policy issue, because people that use drugs don't only need access to treatment, they need access to primary healthcare. They need to, like, some of the underlying conditions. If you think about someone who has an overdose on cocaine, for example, that's also due to a heart condition. Like, you have a bad heart condition. Your heart is not in good condition. It's not the cocaine solely that contributes to your overdose. It's your bad heart health. But we're so busy focusing on the drug. It's such a myopic strategy in dealing with the drug, as if that the drug is not a symptom of a larger issue, right? And so for some people, drugs are not the issue at all. It is the society's response to drugs and the criminalization to drugs that create the health issues, that create the mental health problems. Our budgets are moral documents. And what we have decided to spend our money on is law enforcement, which has engendered a divestment in the social safety net that is necessary for a thriving community. So when people ask me, like, what do our people need? Our people need the society to provide resources in a way that is not predicated on what they look like or what they do, right? That society just needs to provide, and that is enough, right? That people don't have to hop through hoops in order to get access to healthcare, and that healthcare should not be connected to employment. Like, these are things that everyone needs. And I think we would be operating from a different place if people who use drugs that struggle with drugs, right? Because there are lots of people that use drugs and don't struggle, and we don't talk about it, right? But we focus on the population of the people who are struggling. If we're talking about those people, giving people access to housing, giving people access to food, giving people access to healthcare, those things would put us on a different plane, and then the drugs would be a distraction. But when people ask us, what do we need? Folks want me to say treatment. They want me to say they need access to doctors and clean syringes. They need all those things. But before that, they need access to a responsible state. And that is what we don't have.
Okay. And that's exactly, if I may, Walter.
Go right ahead.
Your first point, Kassandra, is so key, right? We talk about economies as if the capitalist structure of creating profit over material goods and exploitation of labor doesn't apply to the informal economy. I would take that to the next level as well to talk about violent crime, right?
That's right.
When we talk about defunding police, Walter, we talk about abolition of cages, the first immediate response by many people is, well, what if this happens? As if violence should only be talked about in the context of interpersonal actions, relationships. So what is it about the violence of the state that deprives people of an opportunity to be literate in their own neighborhoods? That's right. By a failed economic education system? What is it about the violence of the state that refuses to fund the basic necessities of adequate healthcare? What is it about the violence of the state that actually creates and extracts wealth from people to pay for a criminal justice system that they don't want at all? You know, we fail to talk about the violent nature of institutional racism, but we're very happy to talk about interpersonal violence and how that has to be the number one priority for violent crime responses in America. And that's obviously false.
We must talk about, we've got a few minutes left here, another 10 minutes or so. We must talk about what, particularly those of us from the West Coast and obviously Michigan, Ohio, New York, et cetera, people who are facing, who find themselves incarcerated, a country of 2.3 million people, find themselves impacted by COVID. Many of them elderly, should have been let loose a long time ago. Put that in a context so that people understand that, because as I read and talk with people through my work, at some point there's a challenge about why somebody winds up in prison or jail. My friend Sophia Elijah says, hey, you know, going to jail or going to prison is a punishment. You don't go to jail to be punished or to die. So let's get some words out about that for our listeners. First, Tony, was there an aha moment for Tony when you found yourself inside and saw what you were being given that would make you change or go a different direction? Or at what moment did that happen for Tony?
Well, prison is the most existential environment there is. And what I mean by that is something spiritual about spending 15 years in a 6x9 cage. You discover who you are. And people go to prison. A lot of people make mistakes, but they wind up going to prison and are sentenced with these tremendous sentences, 15, 20, 25 years to life for nonviolent drug crimes. I mean, I was in Sing Sing prison. I worked as a law clerk in the library there. I handled many cases, tremendous drug cases where practically the whole population was in prison because of the war on drugs. But for me, what was very spiritual was finding out who I was, and basically the ha-ha moment was when I was sentenced to that 15-year life sentence and thrown into that cage. I knew I had to do something to change my life for the better. I went to school. I got 3 college degrees. I studied. I discovered my talent as an artist. From prison, I showed my work at the Whitney Museum of American Art and a show in 1994. Got a lot of publicity on my case, and that's how Governor Pataki granted me clemency. So for me, the moment that woke me up was the sentence of 15 to life, and what am I going to do to get out and not to give up hope? So that was the ha-ha moment for me.
What do we do around these? I know increasingly women. I spoke with a woman in Boston a few weeks ago, Angela, who runs a program specifically around women. But what do we do at this moment for those people who find themselves dying of COVID? How do we make that connection here so our listeners leave with an understanding of what we must do, the urgency of what we must do?
Well, Walter, the fact of the matter is, you're right. First of all, women are the fastest growing segment of the U.S. prison population, both at state level and prison and federal systems. And when we incarcerate a woman, we're often incarcerating the mother of so many children and devastating their family. There has to be different ways in which we address those issues. But the COVID epidemic, I want to give you a quick story. Jorge Reinaud is our staff member from Latino Justice, Director of Policy and Advocacy out of our Southwest office in Texas. Texas literally has the following situation. It has granted you parole, but you're still inside the gates. It has told you that you have finished all the programming necessary to be released on parole, but you're still waiting to be released. So Jorge and others at grassroots leadership and other people down there are doing surveys of prisoners, 4,000 pieces of mail. We have well over 1,500 responses, and we're documenting the exposure, the health conditions that might expose them to even much more higher risk of COVID. I'm going to repeat what I said. These are individuals already granted parole, but they still have not been released, and they're still in cages, exposed outrageously to the COVID virus. There are, and those stories I'm sure can be replicated at various levels throughout the country. There is excellent advocacy to get rid of, to reduce these populations. New Jersey's considering a population reduction of 20% of its state inmates. Right. All important issues. But here's what Jorge tells me out of Texas, my staff member out of Texas, is exactly what you said, Walter. These individuals have already been sentenced to a particular term in a cage. They weren't sentenced to a death sentence. And to now create distinctions between who merits humanity and who doesn't because of their underlying crime was violent or not is an outrageous affront to all of our humanistic and humanity concerns for prison populations. The COVID epidemic is not just a threat to correction officers, and it should be looked at that way as well, but it's a clear death sentence for so many people.
Kassandra, I see you thinking.
Well, I think part of it is that there is, Deborah Peterson Small talks about the addiction to punishment that this country has. It is an addiction. And it also shows our lack of imagination about how to deal with when people hurt us. Miriam Kaba says you can't hold someone accountable, that someone has to hold themselves accountable. And it's about changing the conditions around people. And so when I think about when Sophia Elijah says, like, sending someone to jail is punishment already, I wonder about what it means for us to actually center the person that has been harmed and figure out, like, how do we center that person or that entity's desires in the way that we build out justice. And oftentimes people will think that people who have been harmed will want these super vengeful things. And what I've learned from reading the works of transformative justice practitioners is that that is not often the case, is that people who have been harmed are often looking for things that actually deal with something for them, right? It's being in conversation. It's the person being surrounded by the harm that they've created. None of those things happen in a cage. A lot of things happen when you cage people. All of them reflect the nastiness of our society's inability to actually bring justice forward. It shows that our society knows how to punish and harm and be vengeful and be disgusting and be dehumanizing, but it doesn't show our ability to change the conditions for harm to happen in the first place. It doesn't show the society's ability to bring justice to the people that have been harmed or stop new harm from happening. And so oftentimes when I think about this moment and caging people and abolition and all these different things, the thing that I keep coming back to is that what we're doing right now is not working, and that there's a lot of arrogance, that we have to keep doing what we're doing because it's what we've always done, regardless of the data that consistently shows us that this is not an effective tool to deal with harm. And I think that that is a conversation that we need to start centering more as we have conversations about when people do things we do not like. That the systems of deterrence are not incentivized to stop harm.
Well, I wish we had another hour or another 2 hours. There's some things on my mind I'd love to raise, certainly to internationalize it, I think to some degree, as all of you have done. I particularly think of the image of young children being separated from their parents, and whether we have kids or grandkids or close kids who are friends of ours, thinking of them going somewhere and not being able to find them at all, is frightening. And that seems to be a template which is part of this militarization and this period that we're in. I'd like to thank Kassandra Frederique, incoming executive director of the Drug Policy Alliance, and we're so glad that that's going to be your new role. We'll be sure to work you to exhaustion as we go forward. I've seen you on YouTube. I know you're up to it. Juan, we are going to have you back at some point. I also want to talk a bit about the roots of Latino justice, the Puerto Rican Defense and Educational Fund, to talk about some of that work. And there's a lot of conversation to be said about developments in Puerto Rico, and particularly how these ideas about criminalization and militarization and the othering have played out with the citizens of Puerto Rico. We need to make time for that. I also want to continue discussion with Tony Papa. Not everyone who walks out has had the opportunity to get enough support to be able to get into communities, to make a difference, and to come. Mumia Abu-Jamal, Angela Davis said the other evening, she said the word she used was radical empathy. And that really resonates with how we have to look at the situation of the connection between the drug wars, incarceration, and the other issues that we've talked about, the militarization we talked about today. Walter Turner, so proud to be here as representative of Global Exchange. Go to our website, www.globalexchange.org. You can listen to these for free. We also appreciate donations so we can keep this work going. And let's consider that donation to Global Exchange as be part of the defunding of where money should go. Juan, Kassandra, and Tony, thank you so much for your time. Very much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Take care.
Thank you.